Hello, and welcome to Section 3, Lecture 4 of the Marlborough Medieval Studies course, The Economic Expansion of Europe. This will be an abbreviated presentation because we will be covering a number of different facets of this expansion in class, including the Italian city-states and some of the northern trading cities in Flanders and the Hanseatic League, as well as the nature of banking and contracts throughout the period. So I'm just going to cover three short aspects to try to give this some historiographic context. The first will be what exactly do we mean by economic expansion? The second, I will look at some of the debates about why this occurs and what are some of the questions that historians still have. And then at the end, I will take a short look at guilds, and that will be it. So, beginning with what do we mean by this? In some sense, this economic expansion is the beginning of what we now think of as globalization. This may seem a little early, and obviously it ignores things like the Islamic expansion in the 8th and 9th century that connects everything from India to West Africa. But this is a point starting at about 1000, and it's in some places a little earlier and in some places a little later, that the economic connections around the globe begin to expand very rapidly. And it's in this period that the Europeans start trading with the Islamic traders who have extended their reach to India, eventually to China. The trade routes that are there never reverse themselves. And this is one of the important features of this, right? By the time we get to the 15th century, the economic trade routes have expanded around the globe. The new world, so-called, is about to be connected with the old. And from that point on, the number of people traveling around the world, bringing goods across the world, and experiencing things from other places never really goes back. And the reason that this is important is that under Rome, all of the Mediterranean was connected. We talked about that a little bit. And the Romans had pepper that came via the Silk Road. There's evidence of Greek sculptural influence as far away as Afghanistan. So it's not as if these places have never been connected. But in the early Middle Ages, after the end of the Roman Empire and Roman connections across these wide spaces, urban life in particular crumbled, and things fell much more to a local or regional level. And this is not universally true. We talked about how the Paren thesis that the Mediterranean closed off at any point is clearly not right, and that traders were moving through the Black Sea and across the northern arc of the North Sea, and how that relates to the Vikings and some of the coins that we find there. So people are always moving around, but the rate and quantity does dissipate somewhat after Rome. There are many, many more places in Europe that do not have a lot of contact with people around them. People who live in these smaller villages don't necessarily know what's going on more than a certain number of miles away. But starting sometime in the 10th century, and certainly by the year 1000, everything is beginning to look more like expansion. The economies of a lot of places are beginning to grow. The number of people is increasing, so that the demography is increasing. Institutions such as market towns and fairs are starting to crop up that will eventually give rise to fairly interconnected economic networks. And some of the famous cities that later will become major trading cities, Venice is probably the most notable. Venice doesn't really exist until this time. It had existed as a sort of Byzantine outpost, and it gained some expansion in 828 when it gets the relics of St. Mark the Evangelist, which are now in St. Mark's Cathedral, one of the most famous landmarks of Venice. But it's really after that point, and that's in 928, it's in the 10th century then that Venice really begins to take on its own character. And it's from about 1000 to 1200 that it goes from being this small outpost to its own autonomous trading center. And these trading centers begin to crop up all over Europe. It's not just northern Italy. As I mentioned, we will be talking further about those in Flanders, those in northern Germany, that eventually would become the Hanseatic League, Lubeck, and Hamburg are the most notable of those. And these markets begin to take on enough economic clout that rulers have to begin to deal with them, both kings and local nobles. And sometimes they use them as a tax base, and sometimes they are hesitant of the amount of power that independent cities are gaining. Sometimes kings will throw their lot in with cities in order to give them an economic buttress against difficulties that they're having with their nobles. And this happens in Catalonia. It happens similarly in England. But in general, the increased number of larger cities, but also economic fairs and trade means that more people are able to get more access to an exchange of goods, a wider variety of goods, and to some extent, the greater use of money as well. And this starts, as I said, in the 10th century. It's going to continue in some sense, and this is the globalization part, all the way to today. We'll look at a couple of maps really quick that illustrate this pretty well. Now, here are the trade routes in 1212. And already this has expanded quite a bit. You can see the northern arc that includes Paris and Cologne, Cologne is an important central fair. Connections to England through Lubeck, all the way to Novgorod, along the North Sea. Trade in a variety of goods, fish and wood and grain, but also wool and tin from England. And of course, the Mediterranean, always somewhat more connected than the North Sea, is also experiencing an increase. At this point, a lot of it is controlled by Genoa and Venice, although there are other, Florence and Pisa, there are other cities that are not even marked on this map. But through Constantinople, and you can see the much better developed system of trade through the east, that is the Silk Road, but also through the Persian Gulf and through the Red Sea, that eventually connected all the way with East Asia. So this is 1212. Here it is in 1478. And the most important one now that you can see is that the northwest coast of Europe, France, and the Low Countries, Bruges, there's now regular trade going through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. So now those two slightly separate worlds are much more connected. Prior, they were connected through things like the Volga River, through Kiev, parts of Russia, overland routes from Italy up to Paris. But those are much slower, and you can't bring nearly as many goods on a train of mules or horses or oxen even, in carts. You can't bring nearly as much as you can in a ship. A ship just carries a huge amount of weight. And that's actually still true today. We use a lot of trucks, but the number of trucks that it takes to pull the quantity that you could fit in one container ship is really astonishing. And so you see this increase in the different numbers of routes, but also an increase in the quantity of types of materials that are moving around between the Middle East and Western Europe, between the Middle East and East Asia. At this point, things like spices have become very common in most of Europe, and those are things that are coming from Indonesia and India, so quite far away. And one last map, just to give you a sense. It's not really until the early modern period, until post-1500, that you will have a single ship or even a group of ships leaving France or Italy or Spain and going all the way to India. The globalization that is happening in the 11th and 12th centuries is connection through intermediary spaces. And this gives you a really good sense. Most traders would move within one of these worlds. So if you were in Cairo, you might spend much of your life trading between Cairo and Aden. Perhaps you would move across one more, so Aden to Calcutta or Bombay. Along the Indian coast, you might go from Cairo to other parts of the Mediterranean, to Tunisia or to Constantinople. But it's unlikely that you would be traversing more than a couple of these spheres of connection and trade. So now let's talk for just a minute about why this occurs. It's obviously difficult to explain when all of a sudden the economy of an entire region starts to pick up, especially when other regions, like the Islamic region, have had an excellent economy. In some sense, they go through a slump in the 13th century, particularly with the appearance of the Mongols. But why one area has a strong economy and another does not, especially over these broad time spans, can be very difficult to explain. Now, it used to be thought, and the great feudal historian of feudalism, Mark Bloch, who is one of the main proponents of that use of that term, used to claim that towns were foreign bodies within the system of feudal production. So the thing that we talked about last time with the fields that are broken up into thin lines owned by a variety of different people, and you owe a certain amount of production to the lord or labor, and you live within this town that perhaps trades with the immediate towns around it to get things that you might not specialize in, but is essentially a regional level of production. Mark Bloch describes these new trading towns as foreign bodies within that system, that they're based largely on their town charter. Their charter gives them certain freedoms that other people do not. They tend to be very guarding of those freedoms. Sometimes for obvious reasons. The freedoms tend to prevent them from sliding into things like serfdom, as we talked about last time. So for Mark Bloch, they are very separate entities that appear in part because of their own desires. And that's something that historians like Roberto Lopez and Henri Pirenne would probably agree with, that to some extent what you also are seeing is the beginning of capitalism, the beginning of people who are just interested in going out and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and figuring out ways to make more money by moving goods greater distances. Now, that explanation has largely come to be seen as a little too simplistic. There are a whole variety of reasons why the economy starts to pick up. And I guess, as I've talked about in previous lectures, I tend to see it as multi-causal in some sense. Other causes include the fact that as royalty and nobility figures out more how to govern larger areas, particularly as the Holy Roman Empire, the ideal of having one ruler over all of Europe, starts to really dissipate, right? The 10th century, we see the end of centralized authority is one of the things we talk about. In the 11th century, you see the Norman invasion of England, you see the Capetian dynasty in France, you see competing larger, somewhat centralized, not certainly the pan-European Holy Roman Empire, but lots of different courts beginning to appear. And they begin to hold more and more lavish palaces and use ostentation as one of the marks of their power. So with these new demands of luxury, and also as they gain some control over larger amounts of land, their buying power goes up, and they begin to demand more and more luxury goods that could include things like spices and silk. Now, their very demand, their very sense of using luxury as one of their symbols of power is one of the things that might help increase the economy in this time period. Now, of course, that doesn't look very capitalist. This is not just merchants figuring out ways to make more money. This is the wealthy nobility of a much more regressive and feudalistic system of production, finding that they have more surplus and demanding more goods. And so then these goods begin to be brought by people who have the capacity to command ships and do that. Another possible reason is, you notice in the 11th century, this is when the Crusades begin. The Crusades actually go to the East. There is some suggestion that simply by having that many people go to a different place, they are then sending goods back and forth. The need of ships for supply drive some of this expansion. And when you have that many ships built for supply, they begin to carry things that are not just for the Crusaders, but they begin to actually carry larger amounts of goods back and forth. And this becomes a staple of crusading, certainly. In the Third and Fourth Crusade, huge numbers of knights will often contract with entire cities. So the city of Venice gets hired to take them and all of their goods to different places, and this is quite lucrative for some of these cities. And another possible reason for this expansion, and I mentioned this before when we talked about climate and the end of Rome, in this period from about 800 to about 1200, maybe as long as 1300, The climate of Europe reaches what is often referred to as the medieval optimum. The growing season expands by a week or two. There are certain lands that are better for farming than they were before. There's a little bit less rain and cold. The winters are a little shorter. There's a little less snow in northern Europe. So everywhere from northern Italy to northern Germany and England and even parts of Scandinavia becomes a little bit more productive than it was before. So it's also possible that just the amount of agricultural surplus entering into these local trading networks might then start to expand the sense of what people could trade for, expand the number of goods that even peasants might have access to. And obviously, an expansion of this sort climatically also means that the lords are collecting more dues, which would help their command and demand of luxuries that would in turn spur trade in that way. So there's several of these different facets that come together to really make the economy take off in the 1200s. Some climate, some demand of luxury products, some increasing standard of living for the lower classes, an increase in demography. There are just more people moving around. And the Crusades going to the east, the greater demand for movement of people and large amounts of goods. But also, there is certainly the charters and freedom that these towns are granted, and the towns themselves do become very important in this trade, and many of them are famous for it, as we already mentioned Venice, but Genoa and Florence, Barcelona, Valencia, Bruges, Lubeck, Hamburg. All over Europe, these cities that are more independent of systems of power, feudal looking systems of power, more independently controlled and more interested in their economic life than they are in their connections to royal or nobility in the political sphere. And one last quick look at how towns might have developed themselves in this system of expanding crop base and expanding demand for luxury products, more people, more moving around. We'll look at one more quick description of how cities develop, and then we will move on to guilds, and then we'll be done. So, central place theory, as you can see, this is the idea that regional markets, as you have a longer growing season and greater numbers of people working and greater amounts of production, that local fairs and markets that have existed throughout the early medieval period, there are lots of grants of fairs by Charlemagne. There are grants in the 9th and 10th centuries. There are always some places to go and trade goods. That as these get larger, you have a small network of small fairs that might happen once a month, maybe once a week. They begin to coalesce around a single larger fair that then begins happening more regularly. People know that that is going on. That feeds its smaller fairs. And if you get enough larger fairs in an area, they will eventually coalesce around one larger trading city. Now, the Hansa look a little like that. They certainly have their smaller regional fairs that feed into their larger centers, but they are also a very politically regulated agreement between different towns that is how they want to act, and they are in the service of the most powerful of those towns. Florence is a fairly good example of this. Florence eventually becomes such a dominant economy in its region that it begins to destroy some of its other competitors in the area. It begins to completely outshine them. And Barcelona is actually a great example of this. And here, this is a map of Catalonia. The yellow is older parts of Catalonia. The pale yellow in the middle is the region immediately around Barcelona. And then the part to the south is taken over from Muslim rulers throughout the 11th century. Now, Barcelona is the purple spot just about in the middle of the map. And as you can see here, it is surrounded by medium-sized towns. To the north and somewhat to the west, there are the towns of Vic and Manresa. To the south, there's Tarragona. But each of these towns is not as major a center as Barcelona, but they are all large regional fairs. And some of them, Vic in particular, still has its weekly fair that people come to from the region. And now, of course, It's beginning to have a modern, almost farmer's market look. You can get locally made leather products, and you can get cheeses and meats that have been made within the region, artisanal products and that sort of thing, wines. But even in the medieval period, it's a very, very old, attested to fair. It became a weekly fair quite early and attracted some of the smaller regional towns to itself. It then funneled goods towards Barcelona, as did these other cities that are marked here. And Barcelona eventually becomes the largest trading city in the region. They have outposts and consulates across the Mediterranean, as far away as Greece, a couple in the Black Sea. But they have all of these trade connections that they control a very wide span of territory and control a great deal of movement of ships and goods. But that is all 12th and 13th century, and it starts really with these regional fairs, all of which are in place already in the 10th century. So this is one of those ways that you might get some of these cities developing in addition to the charters that they have, in addition to the freedoms. So some combination of elements of bottom-up economic push and more top-down, we have capital, we're going to go out and make something happen in the economy. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the type of trade that is going on and some of the possible vectors that go into really kicking it off in the 10th and 11th centuries. So let's talk just a little bit about guilds. Guilds are fairly important, and you could read a whole lot about them, and I'm not going to do them justice in the next 5 minutes, but I want you to know that they exist. Guilds begin as loose organizations in the 11th century, generally organized around control and mutual society. They're all people supposedly working for each other's good, but they also serve to keep other people out of the group. And one way to view them is that they are a response to the idea that greater economic involvement is not necessarily completely to be trusted. Those of you reading about banking and contracts will certainly get a lot of this. Christian theology bans things like usury, the loaning of money. There's a distrust, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. If you just read through the Gospel of Luke, it doesn't treat wealthy people particularly nicely. There's a sense that money is distracting from your ultimate goal of heaven. So there's this Christian break put on increased economic activity. And in a way, guilds are a response to that. There is a distrust of people being their own economic actor. In times of economic crisis, it is assumed not that, as the debate goes today, it is assumed not at all that regulation might be the problem, but rather that things are under-regulated and that people, if left to their own devices, will commit evil. And so, because of this, guilds are almost always organized around a semi-religious theme. They operate a little bit like a confraternity. The groups often will have a patron saint. They will perform religious festivals. They will give a fair amount of money to a church. They also act as a mutual assistance society. So when certain members fall on hard times, some of their alms will come from the collection of the guild, so that they have this very closely tied religious identity that grows up really organically, in part as a way of maintaining their religiousness while participating more fully in economic life and the economic expansion. Now, the actual act of guilds varies from guild to guild. Their purpose and some of the things that they do, while they often represent a private response to the mistrust of totally free markets, how they actually function in practice varies from guild to guild. Some of them emphasize a lot of quality control. You particularly see this in cloth guilds. The cloth makers of Chartres, for example, would only allow a certain quality and had their own basically mutual inspection practices to make sure that if you bought cloth from the members of the guild, it had to be of a certain level. So something like we have government quality checks, particularly in the area of food supply, but in other areas as well, to make sure that what you are being sold is actually of the quality you claim. And so the guild and chart functioned in that way. Some were only based around keeping certain people out, sort of exclusivity of the group. Notaries guilds often look this way. Highly skilled jobs. So notaries are people who write contracts, and they're trained to write in Latin. They write with a variety of hand, and that was considered a skilled position in the 11th century. They also act as the system by which new people are inducted. Often the position of master and apprentice are hereditary. So the master and apprentice, the apprentice might be the master's son in this case, and mostly guilds are men. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But by making it hereditary, or at least having a certain number of hoops to jump through to be a master in the guild, it regulated who was allowed in and who was not. Now, this could also be used as a way of tamping down competition. You could ensure that there were only so many wool makers or silk makers or leather workers or cobblers or whatever the guild was. You could ensure that there was only a certain number of people and that they were all making a similar product. So they have a somewhat monopolistic looking practice, of course. Now, they don't trust open markets, so to some extent that's the point. But they do begin to realize that this is part of what they can do, and it does act, particularly in some of the larger cities, this is true in Florence, to gain them a great deal of political power. When a guild and politics begin to self-involve each other, you find whole guilds that control most of the political life of the city, and their monopolistic practice ensures that they are constantly making a lot of money, and they can use politics to that advantage. So that is something that they quickly realize and put into effect. Now, another thing that guilds do is whenever guilds take over trade, it often begins to exclude women from practicing that trade. Now, women, we talked a little bit about how widows might need some way to earn money, widows in particular, but also women who are not yet married, who find themselves in need of a way to support themselves. There are a number of jobs that women do hold in cities throughout this time period, and we talked some about their agricultural jobs last time. But if a guild moved into that position, women were generally excluded from guild leadership. Sometimes they couldn't be masters, although in some guilds you do find women taking over as master after their husband dies. So widows had a little more flexibility in this regard, and sometimes women would work alongside their husbands. Particularly, cloth making might be a good example of this. You could be an independent cloth maker as a young woman or as a widow and earn some money by selling cloth that you would produce. But as soon as that's taken over by the guild, you would be either pushed out completely, or you had to be tied to a man doing the work. If your husband were in the guild, then you might be able to continue doing some of that. One of the most notable stories of this type is around beer production in England. There's a whole book about this by Judith Bennett, and it takes place mostly in the 14th century, which is a little later than this time period, but it's a good illustration. Up until the 14th century, women tended to be the chief brewers in England. Brewing was done on a house-to-house basis. It was almost entirely dominated by women. They could do it in their home, and they would literally hang a shingle. This is sort of the hang a shingle pub symbol that still gets used. You would hang something outside your front door that said you had beer. You would sell it until it was gone. You usually sold it whenever you had the supplies to make it. And it didn't necessarily have to be an ongoing thing. You could put the shingle out, sell it all in a day, perhaps raise enough money for 3 or 4 days and not have to sell every single day, not a routine thing. So somewhat unstructured, but something that was very common for widows to practice, but most common for women in general. Now, this also relates to the new influx of beer as opposed to ale. Beer was made with hops and from the Netherlands, as opposed to ale, which was made with just barley from England. I won't go into all the details of that story, but suffice to say it's a little more complicated than this. But when beer starts to be produced, beer is a boiled drink, so you need larger amounts of apparatus. You need a large wooden fire to bring large amounts of liquid to a boil so that you can make the beer. That influx of capital then meant that the people controlling these larger breweries tended to form up into guilds Women tended to be excluded from guild leadership, although we still find women brewing even in these larger capital breweries. They are often members of the guild through their husband, as I mentioned before, and the number of women generally begins to drop. And actually, you start to see much more misogynistic descriptions of brewsters, women who are producing beer not in the guilds, widows producing beer and selling it out their back door. And they begin to be vilified, and eventually by the middle of the 15th century, most beer is no longer produced by women. This is one of the ways that guilds could function in society. And to some extent, this mirrors what we talked about with education. In the 11th century, when education was a monastic affair, women had access to monasteries, and there were many very famous, very well-educated women in the 11th century. As soon as education becomes more the purview of the university is male only. And so the number of real standout women intellectuals in the 13th century, in some sense, is lower than it was in the 11th century. It's not that they're gone, but the most common access to education has dried up. And so you see the guilds doing something like that in certain areas of economic life. So we've talked about the economic expansion of Europe, what I think of as somewhat flowery description as the beginning of globalization in the 10th century, when trade connections begin to be established that will never be broken. There is a uneven but relatively constant increase of the number of goods and the amount of goods being shipped from the 10th century onward. This certainly continues to the end of the medieval period. We talked about how some of the causes of that include a changing climate, a larger amount of food being produced, a better growing year, a higher demand for luxury products on the part of the nobles, greater freedoms allowed to towns, town charters that allowed for people to have more control of their own economic and political lives, and also just an increase in movement of people with things like the Crusades and the increasing amount of money that could be gained by people with ships. We talked a little bit about how cities could have developed as a central place around these market fairs that are an older form of exchange of goods. And last, we talked a little bit about guilds and how guilds, in some sense, help to mitigate the religious life and economic life of new, wealthier merchant groups, and a little bit about how guilds helped form the economic life that they governed. So that's just a little bit about the economic expansion. Obviously, there's plenty to say about the Italian cities and the German and Flemish cities and banking and Jews and Muslims and their connection to the European economy. All of that is in the bibliography that you can choose what you're going to read about. Next time we will be talking about the 14th century. The 14th century is the end of this large boom, although a lot of the trade connections don't disappear. It is a slump in the European economy, and we'll be talking about why that happens and what that looks like.